All right, let's talk climate change. Uh, is there climate change? Yeah, but here's where reality separates from the madness that's out there. The climate hysterians, they have an agenda, um, which is making themselves extremely rich. I mean, Al Gore has made $300 million off of the green scare, the climate change scare. $300 million, and his carbon footprint is literally 1,000 times greater than your average person. He doesn't own a zero emissions vehicle. He flies all over the world, multiple houses. That's not somebody who thinks climate change is an existential threat. That's someone who's just trying to make money off of suckers. And unfortunately, there's a lot of suckers. That's how you know the climate scare is fake. Because virtually every so-called scientist, most of them are not climatologists. They're just physicists or whatever, and they just take the word of somebody else. But virtually none of them drive an EV, and that's not good for the climate anyway. But you know, if they want that, if that's what they want in the future, and they think that in the future they'll be able to clean things up that way, well then they should all be driving that. They all have the money. They all can afford that. Maybe not an expensive Tesla, but they have cheaper ones. But almost none of them do. They all have a ton of electronics. Your phones, your laptops, your computers, and many other equipment. They come from China. China's the worst polluter on the planet. Since the bogus climate accord in France, what was it now? It was 8, 9 years ago. Since then, they've added 33 new coal plants. And the dirty coal, like the coal we have here, because of the filtration system we have, is much cleaner. It's still not, good, but it's much cleaner than China. And so that's what's powering your cell phones. They're all made there. And there are fossil fuels that are made with the cell phones and the computers and whatever. Then you have a lot of mining to go. There's gold, there's silver, there's different metals that are in copper and whatnot. Those all have to be mined. Mining is a pretty dirty business in terms of carbon, is it not? In terms of pollution, it's dirty, right? So that's why the right now EVs are actually worse than regular internal combustion engines, because all those metals, the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium, there's a lot of mining involved, and most of it's done in third world countries where they have little to no environmental laws, so they use the worst vehicles in order to do all their mining, and then it has to be shipped over here, and in the worst polluters of all, which is the cargo ships. Those are horrible. Um, right? So if you really believe it's an existential threat, existential, that means we are on the precipice of utter destruction, no return, and we need to change everything right now. I mean, next few years, right now, it all has to change all the way around the world, or the planet's gonna burn up, and we're all gonna die. If you believed that, you wouldn't be driving your car anymore. You wouldn't be flying all over the world. You'd have minimal electronics, and you really would be campaigning hard every day, screaming loudly to you know, for everyone else to follow suit. You'd lead by example. And no one's doing that. That means they don't really believe it's an existential threat. They don't. The scientists that follow along with it, well, guess what they get when they fall in line? They get money for their little pet projects. And of course, there's always, along with that, is money for themselves. I'm not saying that they're getting necessarily rich. Some of them are, but they have their little pet projects that they want to do, and some of those projects can take millions. Hard to get, but if they fall in line with the climate scare, boop, they got all that money in a blink of an eye. So, so let's go back. Excuse me. Let's go to the beginning. Okay. The Ice Age, right, was roughly 2.5 million years ago. They don't have an exact year, but roughly 2.5 million years. When something changed on the planet, and massive, got so much colder, and ice started to form on both poles, and the majority of the Earth ended up pretty quickly being covered in ice. And it stayed that way for nearly 2.5 million years. Now, there were fluctuations that have times where, it would warm up and there'd be a lot less ice, and then it would cool down tremendously, and then so it was big fluctuations. They try and call that those mini ice ages, but you can't. Okay. The reason why is because prior to 2.5 million years ago, as far as we know, for the entire Earth's life, that's 4 billion years. Well, when there was life on the Earth, let's just say 3.5. By the time you had the oceans, all the water we have, and the Earth was teeming with life. No ice on either pole, especially the northern pole, up until 2.5 million years ago. Right, northern Africa, they know with 100% certainty the Sahara Desert was a lush forest. A lush forest. And then 2.5 years ago, something changed, and it all died and became a desert. So, with the ice comes deserts and killing forests. Without the ice, you have the opposite, right? So before the ice, lush forest, ice comes, desert. But they're trying to tell you it's the opposite. They're trying to tell you that if the Earth heats up even just another 2 degrees, then all the ice will melt and then everything will dry. Why would if the ice melted, why would everything dry? That means there's more water, which means there's more moisture in the air because it evaporates. More moisture in the air means more precipitation, rain all over the globe. How would that dry things up? It wouldn't. Where do you think the water goes? Water doesn't just disappear. There's a saying, an expression in the science world, science academia. However much water was, is. Meaning, go back 1 billion years ago, however much water there was on the planet, on or under the ground, on Earth, moisture in the air, all of it, it's the exact same amount today. Not a drop less, not a drop more. It's the same amount. It just gets filtered and it moves around. Some of it goes underground for a long time, and then those aquifers get, cracked open through earthquakes or whatever, and then the water flows and blah blah blah. It just gets shifted around. But it's the same amount of water. So why would the Earth dry up? Why? It wouldn't. And again, we know that before the Ice Age, it would, then both poles going back millions of years ago, had rainforest. There's no ice, no snow, rainforest, because there's that much precipitation. And then, like I said, I just talked about the Sahara Desert, and then all over the world there was more deserts, more rainforests. So it was much, much greener. It was much hotter than now, much, much hotter than what they predict it'll be in 100 years. And it was teeming with life. Now, were the low-lying areas that we have today, were those underwater back then? Yeah, they were. Now, some of that water has gone underground, aquifers and underground rivers and whatnot, shifted around. So whatever's ice is left, they estimate probably seas might rise 15 meters, which is, I don't know, it's like 19 feet, 18 something. Okay. So we have time before that happens, plenty of time. None of us will be alive by the time all the ice melts. So build some seawalls. You can raise up. They've done it before, where they've raised up entire cities. I mean, a big swath of Chicago over 100 years ago, they raised it up, I think a foot or so. You can do that. You can, especially if you have a place like low-level place like Florida and whatnot. You can raise it. You can also put seawalls. You can do a little bit of both to mitigate what's coming way in the future, right? And so if that's all, that's the only issue with climate change, is that it's people who live in the very low-lying areas, you may have to move, or there's going to be disruption for many, many years in your life to get it so that you're okay. That's it, right? But they're putting this scare on you, and people don't do their own. I've done a lot of research, a lot. I mean, a lot. I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but for a layperson, I'd say I'm just about as knowledgeable as possible. So, like I said, as far as we know, other than, roughly, 65 million years ago when that giant meteor hit what is now Mexico, and part in the water, part out, and you had a massive dust and carbon and all kind of stuff, sulfur and stuff, in the air, and so the whole atmosphere was just filled, and so no sunlight was getting in for a long time. So for a short time, maybe a few hundred years, you had some ice, but it was not really enough to consider it an ice age. I'm sorry. But then that all settled down, and that slowly went away, and then everything went back to normal. The planet has a rhythm. It's a living planet. It's alive. I don't mean it's alive like humans, where it has a consciousness and sits there and thinks and goes, let's see, what do we do today? No, that's not what I'm talking about. But it's a living thing, like a tree. A tree is alive. It doesn't have consciousness like a human. There is a very low level consciousness, but Anyway, so my point is there's a rhythm that the Earth normally follows. It spins at a certain pace. And something threw it off the pace roughly 2.5 million years ago. We don't know what exactly. I mean, just who knows what it is. And we may never know. But something threw it off, and it threw everything off kilter, and the weather just went wacky to wacky. Now, the reason I always say the ice age isn't over is because before 2.5 million years ago, there was no ice ever. ever for 4 billion years. So it's not, ice age isn't over until all the ice is gone. I, I know they like to just say, well, um, you know, we called it an ice age because most of the northern and southern hemisphere was covered in ice, and now most of it's not, so it's over. No, no. They use that because they can manipulate this climate nonsense to everyone. So, because if we agreed that the ice age isn't over, then you would start to understand and go, oh, okay, that's why the Earth is heating up naturally, because it's been heating up for a long, long, long time. Hundreds of thousands of years. It's been slowly heating up. Um, and so it's going to keep doing that for, I don't know, 100, maybe as much as 200 years um, before all the ice is melted. And then that's back, it'll be back to its normal rhythm. Uh, Here's a little fun fact for you. The amount of carbon in the air 2.5 million years ago, before the ice age, they've done the drilling in the ice so they can tell. And at the beginning, so basically at the beginning of the ice age, there was 400 parts per million carbon in the air. And then after the ice age, that went, I don't know how low, probably in half or less. But when we started in the 1850s to calculate that, I'm not sure how accurate they were back then, but we'll just consider them accurate. According to scientists, in 1850, carbon in the atmosphere was 250 parts per million. And now we're back up to 400 parts per million. So we're at, and it's been that way for quite a while, for decades. It's been 400 parts per million. Yeah, I think for decades, yeah. So we're at the level of carbon that we were prior to the ice age, right? So, you see my point though? Carbon isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. We need carbon, but we need carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out. And then when the plants breathe that in, that's what they need to be healthy. And then they breathe out oxygen. They don't need the carbon monoxide, which just comes from your tailpipe of your car, factories, smokestacks. And that they can still, they're still okay with it, but they're not running at optimal level. Like trees, when they breathe in carbon monoxide, you see them in cities. There's trees still thriving and still alive for hundreds of years, but it's not at optimal levels. So we do need to obviously watch the pollution, and we do need to cut back on the carbon monoxide. But we don't need some crazy drastic measures. Here's another nugget for you. 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, all of that, 400 parts per million of carbon. Now think, what happened 2020, 21, and even early in 2022 for some people? We were locked down. For the whole world, pretty much half the world was locked down. They were in their house, businesses were closed, people weren't driving cars, less trucks on the road, less boats out into sea. You didn't have cargo ship. I mean, you have less cargo ships, but you have also no cruise ships and yachts and all that. So even with roughly half of carbon spewing vehicles not moving, the level of carbon stayed exactly the same. It didn't fluctuate at all. So that tells you that along with everything else I've already said, tells you that the vast, vast majority of the increase in temperature is not man-made. It's natural. It's the Earth going back to its normal rhythm. Think about it. I mean, because of for a good year plus, half the Earth was locked down, and the carbon didn't come down at all. It should have come down if we're the problem, and when it comes to spewing carbon. So clearly, we're not the problem. Again, we still need to clean up, but the main thing we need to clear is like the waterways. People, there's too much pollution in the waterways and killing species and stuff. But in terms of carbon in the atmosphere, right now it's fine. This is a good level. So here's another thing. Commercial greenhouses, the big ones that sell the produce. What they do is they pump in to the greenhouse carbon up to 800 to 1,000 parts per minute, per million. Sorry, 800 to 1,000 parts per million of carbon they pump in to the greenhouse. Now, why would they do that if carbon is bad? The results of that are the crops grow bigger, faster, greener, and they use less water. That's at double to 2.5 times the current carbon in the atmosphere. Right? Also, NASA, I think it was last year, I think it was the beginning of last year, maybe the end of 2021. They came out and they put out a paper that said right now the Earth is going through a greening effect. Going back to what I just said about carbon, that there's a lot of areas around the Earth where crops are growing, just wild stuff, not crops that we're doing, growing greener, bigger, using less water. They can see all that with their satellites, and you can see all that. So again, carbon isn't the enemy. It's not. Period. It's not. Excuse me. So let's talk about this phony baloney climate model. So a guy named Michael Mann, decades ago, scientists came up with this model. And what he'd used to make the model, the climate model for the future, is tree rings. Study the tree rings to find out about increase in temperatures. Problem with that, if you talk to any scientist worth their salt, as climatologists, they'll tell you that studying tree rings for climate change is very inconsistent. It's not good. It's not very good to measure, climate change. So other scientists around the same time, when he came out with his little theory, they came out with more stuff. But of course, the international climate, I forgot what, ICP or something, they came out and they picked Michael Mann's little theory. Why would you do that? It's not reliable, right? Not reliable, not consistent. It's not good. That's what they picked. And when you have a model, when things don't conform to the model, then you just need to adjust so that you can better predict things. Well, they've never adjusted it at all. They've just stuck with that model for decades and say, well, that's it. You can't do that. Not if you're a real scientist. Now, here's one thing that the general public, most people don't even know. That a while back, there was 15 years where the climate stopped increasing on heat. For 15 years, it just stopped. So it was going up incrementally, slowly, and then it just stopped for 15 years. The scientists have no clue why it stopped. And then it just suddenly started again. They have no idea why it happened. That tells you what? We can't predict the future that well of climate. We can't. Hell, just look at the weatherman. You know. So, and if it was just that they were wrong, it'd be one thing. The problem is they do have nefarious things that they're trying to do because of this. Basically, look at it this way: you see how they're pushing so hard for EVs, even though we don't have the capability of doing it. We don't have the power grid. There's not enough raw materials, the cobalt and the nickel, especially in the whole planet. There's just not that much of it to have so many EVs. And remember, it's not just your EV, because sometimes with somewhere between 5 and 10 years, that battery is done and needs to be replaced, because the rest of the car can still be good. It's only 5 or 10 years old, but the battery is done, and you can't just recharge it. It's not like the old cell batteries that you can just recharge. So you have to have extra batteries. So it's not just, so if you have 100 million EVs out there, you also have to have 100 million batteries. Maybe not 100 million, but you got to have tens of millions of batteries on the side, so when those break down, they can be replaced. And then also, of course, the cost, and then they're just not reliable. In places where it's super, super hot, if they sit out in the heat, they can catch fire. Those batteries, they can just explode. I had my lithium battery in my phone explode on me once, years ago. It actually exploded because I was driving my 18-wheeler. I had the phone in a little cup holder, and I didn't realize that the sun was beaming down on it through the windshield. And after a few hours, suddenly I just heard pop and smoke coming from my phone. And then I pulled it out, and it had busted, it had puffed up, and it was all bowed out. So it's roughly the same type of battery, a similar battery. And so we've seen some of them in Florida and Arizona and catch fire because of the heat. And then, of course, we see what happens in extreme cold. So they're just not reliable. You can't use them all year round in much of the country. So that's not the way to go. I'm sorry. Again, we do need to watch the pollution. And we do need to get away eventually, as much as possible, from fossil fuels. But there are other options that are viable. Hydrogen, not hydroelectric, hydrogen, just straight hydrogen. Basically, just water is 2 parts hydrogen, and they have a small converter that pulls the hydrogen out, spits out the water, and then a little bit of conversion in your existing engine, and you can run on hydrogen. It's cheap, and it's clean. And that technology has been around for 50 years. But it can just run on water. So that's why it's been squashed, because who's going to make money off of that? The oil companies, the car companies, politicians, they can't make money off of it. Because water's cheap. And then there's also a new one, ammonia. Yeah, I just been seeing that for a while. It's three simple ingredients to make ammonia. Is cheap, and a little converter on your existing engine, and your car can run on ammonia. So there are different ways, and it's gonna have to be multiple things. It's not going to be one or two. It's going to be like 5 or 6 different um, things to, you know, power the grid and power vehicles. So anyway, so I hope you understand what I'm saying. That yes, there is climate change, but the vast majority is just the Earth naturally going back to its normal rhythm. So don't get caught up in all the fear mongering. So, all right, thanks.